warm welcome. We have 165 participants. Wow. So a really big warm welcome to Envisaging the Future of Autistic Activism, presented by Yo. Now, Yo is a legal and autism trainer and consultant based in the UK. She develops and delivers training on legal and autism topics for local government staff, mainly social workers. She is autistic and a parent of autistic children. Yo is currently strategic lead of the National Autistic Taskforce, led the development and publication of an independent guide to quality care for autistic people, and is a member of the strategic oversight group for the mandatory autism training trial in England. Wow, that's amazing, Yo. So if you have questions at the end, if you could either type them in the Q&A or put an exclamation mark in the chat, and we'll come round to you at the end. So is that okay? Over to you, Yo. Thank you.
Thanks, Madge. Okay, so thanks, Madge, for that introduction. Saves me having to go into too much detail about my background and experience. I'm hoping to make this as interactive a presentation as possible. This is intended to be a workshop. During the presentation, I'm going to put up some polls and invite you to vote on things. I'm also going to ask people to participate by typing in the chat box. So it would be very helpful if people could try to avoid typing in the chat box simply to chit chat. It's absolutely fine to chit chat, but please do that over on Discord where there is a channel specifically for that purpose, okay? Because I'm going to ask you to type things in the chat box to actually respond to some of what I'm saying. You're also very welcome to ask questions at any time, but please do that by typing in the question and answer box, okay? So, the presentation that I'm going to give today, I'm talking about the future of autistic activism. And something that I've noticed over many years of involvement in the autistic community is that an awful lot of passion and a lot of effort isn't always enough to actually enable us to get heard and to make a difference to areas that really matter to autistic people and our day-to-day lives. So I want to encourage people to think about what areas we might want to influence. Because in my experience, we often get kind of trapped inside the autism world. And actually, the autism world is a very small little bubble. And really, out there in the big wide world, things that happen inside the autism bubble aren't necessarily things that actually affect our day-to-day lives. So I think that the areas that really do impact our lives are areas like having the right to make our own decisions as adults, physical health care and access to it, mental health services, social care for many of us, education, money, benefits, welfare rules, law enforcement, contact with the police, employment and access to employment, and probably quite a lot of other areas. And all of those areas of social policy are broader areas which are outside of the autism world, and yet they have a day-to-day impact on our lives. So the first poll I'm going to offer you is to invite you to vote on which of those areas you think most impacts on a significant number of autistic people's lives. Now, I'm sure most of you will think, well, it's more than one area, but go for the one you think is the most important. Okay, while people are voting, I'm just going to answer a question. So Karen asks, what do I mean by the autism world? Well, what I mean by that is talking to other autistic people, talking to specialist charities in the autism world, talking politically about autism acts, autism strategies, autism policy. That's what I mean by inside the autism world. So the voting is going strong, and let me see. Ooh, mental health has a narrow lead at the moment over right to make our own decisions. Employment's up there. Practically no one going for law enforcement. Okay, so lots of you have voted. I'll close the poll in about 10 seconds so that I can put the answers up for everyone. You'll only be able to participate in the poll if you are accessing Zoom via the Zoom app. If you are doing so via a browser, you may not be able to see or participate in a poll. Okay, right, so for those of you who can see it, here are the results. So mental health is our winner as most important, but quite a good spread, I think, between a lot of different areas of life. The right to make our own decisions, money, welfare, employment, all of those things people think are relatively important. So what I'm suggesting is that when we're thinking about areas that we might want to influence, we need to recognize that the areas that actually impact on people's day-to-day lives tend to be areas that are not just about autistic people. They're broader areas of social policy. So to be effective in influencing those, we need to think carefully about how to do that. And a secure foundation for understanding what's going on in most of those areas of policy is found in what's called public law. And that involves things like human rights, various conventions, Act of Parliament in England, other legislation and constitutions around the world, equality or anti-discrimination laws, things like constitutional rights pretty much everywhere except the UK, citizenship rights in some countries, and also a set of rules which are not so clearly defined, public law principles which exist in England and indeed in international law, principles like fairness, due process, and things of that nature. So it helps to be aware of those fundamental rights and areas of law that can impact on and influence all of those areas of policy that we might be interested in influencing. So in trying to make sense of what's going on in those areas of policy, it helps to make ourselves aware, do a mapping, if you like, of relevant areas of law and policy and the actual laws and policies that exist in them. So this is where I'd like people to contribute in the chat box. As I put up different areas of law, I'd like you to think and name in the chat box what you know about, what you're aware of that is a law or a policy in that area, whether it's in the UK or anywhere else, but if you can please state what country it's in, that would be quite helpful. So yeah, few people have already said the Autism Act. Okay, great, that's in the autism area. How about mental capacity or guardianship? People suggest some things there. What about mental health? What laws or policies do you know about there? Oh yeah, lots of good suggestions coming through in the chat box. How about adult protection or safeguarding laws? Know of any of those? Laws around social work or social care may provide entitlements to support of various kinds. Okay, yeah, loads and loads of good suggestions coming up, brilliant. How about children's law or child protection? That can be very relevant both to autistic children and to parents of autistic children. And education, what laws or policies might there be in that area? Okay, so yeah, we've got some fabulous knowledge community-wise, judging by what's coming up in the chat box, which is absolutely brilliant. But it does really help if you want to influence one of those areas to gather up that knowledge, to put together a map of all of the relevant laws and policies in that area. Because it's quite likely in most countries that there are laws and policies in each of those areas, many of which will have a bigger impact on autistic people's lives than the things that came up at the beginning, like the Autism Act, which I'll come back to as an example later on. So it's really important to develop our knowledge and expertise. I'm just going to answer Anna's question because it's a really good one. So I've mentioned England a couple of times, also the UK once so far. Am I referring to English law specifically rather than Scottish law? Yeah, that's a very difficult one because some of the laws that I'm talking about, the Human Rights Act, the Equalities Act, for example, are UK-wide in their application. Many others, the Mental Health Act, the Care Act, and so on, are England-specific that I have particular expertise in, although I have some familiarity with the Scottish law as well. So yeah, one of the difficulties in the UK is that sometimes I'm in the UK and sometimes I'm in England. I am usually, and I do try to be very precise in which one I'm talking about, but feel free to check with me if I'm not sufficiently clear. Okay, so yeah, although I will talk about examples from England because it's where I know best, much of what I'm saying can be applied in any country, and a lot of good examples have been put in the chat box of laws and policies from all around the place. So developing relevant knowledge and expertise is a huge help to effective activism. It really helps to seek advice and feedback from others, to read and research, to try and avoid reinventing the wheel. If you can come up with an idea, the chances are quite good that somebody's had it before. Go find out before we go out and suggest it. So I'm suggesting a couple of different approaches to this. Now I'm going to skate over this fairly briefly in this presentation, but one of my handouts provides a lot more detail on this. So from that sort of mapping of laws and policies, you can kind of map the whole process from the top down. How are new policies developed? Who gets a say in this? Do those things actually affect practice? Do they affect what actually happens on the ground? So by way of an example, I'm going to invite you to participate in another poll, those of you who are able to access it. Okay, good. Okay, sorry, I'm just typing momentarily in the chat box to stop a distraction. Okay, so the poll I'm going to put up now is to ask you to vote for which types of organisations you think it might be most important for autistic people to influence. Yes, I'm afraid it's quite deliberate that there isn't an all of the above option, because that would have won by miles. So try and go for the one you think that's most important, if you could only talk to one of them. Not surprisingly though, we've got quite a varied range of responses. Yeah. So I think professional registration and regulatory bodies are going quite strongly. Not much for parent care organisations. Give people a few more seconds to vote. Yes, apologies that this is quite difficult to translate for people in other countries who aren't necessarily easily able to work out what these categories would look like in their own countries. I'm happy to talk about that in the discussion. Okay, so I'm going to end the polling now and give you a chance to see the results. So yeah, we've got a narrow win for professional registration and regulatory bodies, but a real mix there. Lots for inspectorates, unions. Yeah, the big charities in the autism field. Yeah, I would say that it really, really depends on what exactly you're trying to influence. But often, take the big charities in the autism field. Are they good to influence if you want to affect what autism research gets funded? Yeah. But if you want to affect, say, mental health law, not much point. They don't have any control over that. So it's really helpful to think about which organisations actually are relevant to directly affecting the issues that you care about or you want to influence. Now, mapping things from the top down is not the only approach to doing this. It can also help to look at it from the bottom up. So starting with a particular situation that bothers you, say you don't like the way, just to take something from the chat box, you don't like the way the media talk about autistic people. So what affects the media's decision making? Well, thinking off the top of my head, advertising revenue would be one of those things, and quite a lot of other influences as well. And working your way up that tree, so for example, what affects where advertisers advertise. You can sometimes identify key levers that are relevant to influencing something that you care about. It's also, in my experience, important to acquire knowledge that you can't get from books. Now, there is more detail on this in my handout, because this is one of the things that took me the longest time to figure out, because like a lot of autistic people, I read lots of books and learned lots of stuff that I could I learned lots of things that I could recite off the top of my head, but it was still very difficult to establish credibility when trying to influence policy. And some of that knowledge that you can't get from books is a type of knowledge that's often called practice or clinical experience, depending on what the field is. That knowledge of how things actually work in the real world, not just the theory of how things ought to work. And this is a difficult type of knowledge often for autistics to get our head around, at least the way some of us see the world. But it's a very important type of knowledge to have when it comes to actually understanding what really makes a difference. So, for example, I've always found it very helpful to, I think once I realized that most people in a work environment, an employment environment, their primary motivation is not upsetting their boss. Once I worked that out, I found that really helpful in making sense of what people actually do in the course of their jobs. So once you've done all this reading and thinking and gathering of knowledge, it also helps to analyse it a bit, to ask yourself things like, how are laws made? How do laws get changed? How are laws enforced? Are they enforced? That's a really, really important question, because I get asked all the time, or I hear people call all the time for new laws to do something that's already against the law or already required by law. But the problem is actually that that bit of law isn't actually being enforced meaningfully, or people can't get funding to pursue a legal challenge, for example. Lots of other things influence practice, and not just laws as well. So inspection frameworks, performance measures, targets, those are very, very influential in many areas. So in social care in England, it's the Care Quality Commission ratings and what they require that massively influences what care providers do. In education, again in England, it's what Ofsted says that massively influences what schools do. So working all of that out is extremely important to helping you identify what's worth influencing and what isn't. But it's also really important to realise that we have limited resources, both individually and collectively. And we won't always manage to do all of the necessary work to make a difference to every issue that we might care about in every situation. And it's important to be somewhat strategic, to think about whether we're actually going to make an effective difference, whether it's worth using our limited resources on this particular issue. Sometimes that can be a matter of setting aside your emotional reaction to how much something annoys you or upsets you, and thinking really pragmatically about what is actually achievable and what is worth expending resources on. And in doing that effective targeting, you need to think about opportunities. Things are not always, it's not always the right moment to influence something. So timing is important, yeah? Trying to influence policy about events that involve lots of people getting together probably isn't something that anyone's going to be terribly interested in talking about in the middle of a pandemic, for example. Sometimes you have to pick and choose your moments. You can also need to consider allies, because if you're trying to influence things in the broader world, it's very difficult to get heard, and it's well worth thinking about whether we can recruit some allies. And sometimes that can involve making less palatable choices. So I just want to ask people to type some suggestions in the chat box about potential allies, organizations, groups of people generically who we might need to consider working with in order to influence some of the things that we might want to influence. Yeah, so larger disability organizations, pan disability, parents Yeah, parent carer organisations. Yes, even the NAS, I'm afraid, and other organisations which may not necessarily be hugely popular. Okay, yeah, and now not surprisingly, the chat box is absolutely jam-packed with suggestions. Yeah, and not just other activists, other campaigning groups. Sometimes we need to form alliances with people who we may not totally agree with about everything. And that can be quite challenging at times, but also necessary, because again, there's that perspective from outside the autism world, because once you stand outside that bubble of the autism world, actually the autism world is tiny. And in the broader context of, say, social policy on support for disabled people, autism is a tiny, tiny little island tucked away in the corner somewhere. The dominant conversation in the media is about older people, who comprise the vast majority of those who require such support. Yeah. And so getting heard often requires getting together, even where we disagree about some things, with parents groups, with groups of professionals. It's also really crucial, as I mentioned earlier, to identify the motivating factors. What motivates your allies, what motivates the people who you want to influence. Because if you're going to target something that doesn't motivate people, you're not actually going to achieve change. So then you've got to get your foot in the door. Getting listened to, not easy. It helps to be known, and not just known for complaining and agitating, but also known for having an interest, having useful or relevant or important things to say about an area that you want to influence. Personally, I've found it can be extremely successful strategy to exerting influence to be useful. If you can provide expertise which isn't available elsewhere, whether that's collective knowledge from the autistic community, technical knowledge in something specific, putting in hours of work on compiling a research review that nobody else is prepared to do, for example, that can really help in terms of gaining influence. It also really helps not to be working alone. It is perfectly possible to influence things as an individual, but if you do get together with others, then it really helps to think about forming a properly constituted group. And when you do that, and when you're then talking to other people on behalf of the group, to be clear about whether you are trying to be a representative group that's representative of autistic people, and even if you are trying to be, how representative you are. Really difficult one for many of us. Be reliable. That means being very cautious about making promises that you can't keep, and trying very hard to fulfill your commitments when you've said that you will do something. It also pays to take other people with you, refer and recommend. If we're going to collectively get listened to as a community, then it doesn't hurt to give each other a leg up whenever we get the opportunity. Unfortunately, the cold hard truth in my experience is that very, very frequently, far too frequently, when autistic people speak in a public context, we get dismissed out of hand. It shouldn't happen, but it does. Things that you can do to try not to get dismissed. Demonstrate prioritization. Demonstrate that you can recognize what is and is not really important in the bigger picture beyond your own experience. Be realistic. Make sure that what you're proposing or suggesting is something that's actually achievable or realistic to achieve. Lots more details on those in one of the handouts. Self-awareness, this is a very tricky one for us, but Autiscape's a great place to get feedback from other autistics. Recognizing that a lot of the time, NTs in meetings where there's an autistic person present are rolling their eyes and giggling behind their hands because we're going on about something that they're not interested in. Try to provide more than just an idea. So if it's great if you've got an idea, but take the time to seek advice from other people and develop it into a coherent proposal, not just an idea. Try to represent more than just yourself. So if your feelings, if your thoughts are coming from your own experience, fine, but don't assume that that is the same as all other autistic people's experience. Check, ask people, find out. So I'm just going to address a couple of things that cropped up in the question box. Yeah, I think being non-speaking can pose a considerable barrier in advocacy, because I don't use the phone myself, and the number of times this creates barriers is a pain, because NTs seem to be completely obsessed with using the phone in meetings and speech above all else. But it is possible still to influence things by writing in newspapers and blogs and social media, I dare say. Not that I would know anything about that. Is masking necessary for effective activism? That's a very good question, and I'm afraid the answer is yes. I wish it weren't, but yes. In order to establish credibility, I have definitely had to develop a professional identity that causes me to look considerably less autistic and disabled than I actually am. Identify your sources of knowledge. Yeah, so how do you know what you know? By all means, speak from your own experience, but say where that's where you're getting the knowledge from. If you're getting it from academic studies, cite the exact studies and so on. Now, I mentioned that a key part of credibility is offering solutions. So not just an idea, not just complaining about this is wrong, that is wrong, fix it, but actual proposals about how it could be fixed. And to do that, you kind of have to do your homework. What's been tried before? Why isn't it working? Has anyone else developed or suggested a solution that you can support? You also need to demonstrate balance. Acknowledge the pros and cons of all proposals, including your own. And if possible, offer more than one potential solution. So I want to suggest an example problem here to illustrate, and ask you to put some ideas in the chat box for potential solutions that could be offered. So, for example, let's take the issue of poor mental health amongst many autistic people. What could be proposed as a solution for that? Okay, yeah, so that is indeed very interesting. We have solutions all over the map, which doesn't unduly surprise me, but many of us might think that what comes first to our mind, well, that's what all other autistic people think, except we don't actually. There's a huge range of possible solutions out there, lots and lots of things. So the question was, if we take an example problem, poor mental health amongst autistic people, what could we put forward as a solution? And we've already got dozens and dozens and dozens of, I'm sure, excellent suggestions. But which of those should we take forward in a collective activism context? Well, we need to evaluate them. We need to look at them hard and do our homework. Has that been tried before? If it's been tried before, why isn't it working? Has somebody else already developed or suggested something along those lines? What are the good parts of that idea, but also what are the downsides? So showing that you are able to offer actual solutions and not just harp on about problems is really important, as is being able to demonstrate that you can see the pros and cons of solutions, including those proposed by others, as well as proposed by ourselves. So we've got another very good question about how do we make our advocacy accessible so that folks with intellectual disabilities can participate. I think that is a fabulously good question, and I wish I had a fabulously good answer. I would very much like to achieve that. I think that we have a hugely long way to go, and it's very challenging to figure out how best to achieve that. But I agree it's an important consideration, because it's very important to bear in mind that pretty much by definition, most autistic self-advocacy organizations are not actually fully representative of the full autistic community. So just to sort of wrap up really, that process of evaluating that I'm talking about involves some hard choices and careful thought about answers. So new law is an answer to things, except they're often not the answer to things. Good example of this would be the Autism Act. So when I asked for suggestions, apologies for the England specific focus here, but when I asked for people to name laws and I put up autism, not surprisingly, there were lots of mentions of the Autism Act. Well, for those who aren't familiar with it, the Autism Act says that the government has to write a strategy, and they did. That's it, the whole thing. I don't know a single autistic person's life who is demonstrably better as a result of the Autism Act. So we need to think about whether law is really what we need. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's something else. We need to think about what levers are actually effective at changing things and what are ineffective. If you take criminal justice for an example, politicians absolutely love trotting out higher sentences about things, right? So we don't like this happening, we don't like crime, and so we're going to increase sentences for such and such. And generally speaking, people love it. But there are donkey's years of criminological research showing that it makes absolutely no difference whatsoever to the crime rate, none. What does make a difference to the crime rate is funding of the police and the likelihood of being detected, not the length of sentences. So we need to actually think about and find out about what will make a difference and what won't make a difference. So, follow the money. That's always good advice when you're evaluating proposals. Where's the money for it going to come from? Why would anybody pay for it? How are we going to motivate them to pay for it? Identify rights, going right back to what I said in the beginning about public law. Are there any rights at stake here? Clearly identify and articulate them. If there is already a law that says somebody should do it, whose responsibility is it? And always remember to watch out for unintended consequences. So think through, discuss with others what completely unintended side effects the proposal that you've thought of might have. So to summarize, think beyond autism, realize that there are wider social policies that may well impact on our lives more than things that have autism in the title. Map the laws and policies which exist in your country, in your area, around what you're interested in. Develop relevant knowledge and expertise. Target what you are focusing on for your activism effectively. Yeah, think about what affects people, think about when is a good opportunity to raise a particular issue, think about who you're talking to and your audience, and focus your limited resources effectively. And to achieve credibility, try and get your foot in the door and prevent yourself from being dismissed. Prioritize what you focus on. Be realistic about what you're trying to achieve. Try and offer solutions, not merely problems or ideas, and consider your presentation and how you are perceived in a largely NT environment. And part of doing that is evaluating proposals, both yours and others, critically. So I've got one final poll for you here. I've got some suggestions of questions that you should ask yourself before trying to get heard from an advocacy point of view. So I'm going to put these up on the slide. Here are my suggestions, but I'd like to know what you think about which of these questions you think it's most important to ask yourself before you start speaking up, trying to be heard, trying to get something done. Okay, so we've got a very wide range of answers. I'm going to bring the polling to an end now. Nearly everybody has managed to respond. Okay, and I will share the results with you now. So our winner, I think, by some margin is, will this realistically bring about change, and if so, how? Yeah, that is indeed a very, very important question. How significant impact does it have on people's lives is probably our second most important one there. Yeah, I think those are really, really good questions to ask ourselves. And hopefully some of the tips that I've provided here and the additional tools which are available in the handouts will help some of you to get heard more effectively. Thank you very much. I will be going to the discussion later if people want to come and talk to me and ask me more questions then. Apologies to anyone whose questions I haven't managed to respond to on here. And I think that's me pretty much done.